Well, good morning. I'm Archbishop Philip Freier, and I'm virtually joining you this morning for a breakfast conversation. And out of nostalgia, I've got the background of Federation Square, where we've mainly had these events. And I hope that wherever you're joining from, you're getting a clear signal. And I'm really glad today to be joined by two guests, Michelle Grattan, who is one of Australia's most distinguished political journalists, is joining us from Canberra. Welcome, Michelle. And
Morning.
Joe Knight, who is CEO of Anglican Overseas Aid, a passionate advocate for community source solutions to change in the world. And we'll learn something more of their different perspectives as we go through the conversation. I particularly recognise that I join you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I commence with this prayer in their language, the Woiwurrung language. Well, with a forthcoming federal election, there probably is nothing more important in a society like ours, for the sake of our democracy, that we might be informed participants in that process. And in the spirit of these conversations, trying to get behind the headlines and the sound grabs and the short capture of things to open out and tease these things a bit more completely, we have the opportunity of some conversation, first of all, between the three of us, and then to open up the conversation to any questions you have. And there is a chat function on your screen. And if you, at any stage through the conversation, want to ask a question, please put that there, and towards the end of our session, we'll go through and work through your questions. We'd like this to be as participatory as possible in this environment. Well, we don't have an exact date for an election yet, but we know it's sort of just over the horizon. And I guess it is the kind of opportunity we have to grasp something of the shape of our Australian society for the next period of time ahead. We also know that there's a lot of modern political process that seems to be informed by focus groups, hearing what citizens think, marginal electorates. And I'm just interested to open up for a start, perhaps with you, Michelle. What do you think is the state of where the main influence in our political conversation will be over this next period of time until the election?
Well, I think that this election is marked by the fact that we've come out of such a difficult period. Well, maybe we haven't actually come out of it yet, but we do look to be seeing the other side on the horizon. But it's left the community exhausted, and I think that it's taken a lot out of the political process, so that we're not really seeing parties put forward very strong and well-defined visions for the future. We've seen the government emphasising themes of economic management, of national security, but not coming up with much in the way of dramatic ideas. And Labor, as we know, is running a very cautious approach, and it's really trying to avoid error rather than take risks and put forward anything that's very dramatic. So it's a campaign that will be very much dominated by focus group research, and that's perhaps a longer term feature of our contemporary politics. You get leaders following more than leading, and I think that has quite a lot of negatives for our society. So the time ahead is influenced by what we've been through and by the nature of politics today.
Yeah, and thanks, Michelle. And Joe, how do you feel? How are we an exhausted electorate? What's our opportunity of having a bigger picture vision?
Well, I think we must demand a bigger picture. We must demand a hopeful agenda. You know, my generation, and certainly, you know, I'm a mum of young boys. I want to see a brighter future for Australia. We're actually tackling some of the structural issues and the issues of injustice that we face. I think, if anything, the last 2 years of the pandemic have really revealed some of those underlying issues that we face around, you know, poverty and First Nations people, how we treat foreigners, how we, you know, look after each other, how we relate to government and just sort of accept when governments make all sorts of decisions that affect our lives. And so, if anything, it might have been covered for a while, and we saw all sorts of policy levers being pulled out to solve a massive crisis in the pandemic. But it doesn't leave unchanged some of those structural inequalities that we see in Australia. And I think that we can and must demand a hopeful future. There certainly is the vacuum, as we were saying, and certainly exhaustion. But at the end of the day, our politicians work for us, and we need to call them to account and call them to better. And there's no shortage of ideas from the community sector and all sorts of parts of civil society that have wonderful ideas and solutions and cost of proposals and ways forward. But there's often a reticence to actually engage and hear from other parts of society instead of just focus groups and so forth. So I think part of it is our posture as an electorate and not accepting that it's okay to just have a vacuum and sort of be cynical about politics and our politicians, because it does affect our lives and our futures and our children's futures. And I think as Christians, we come at it from a position not of fear, but of hope, of God's hopeful vision of what it can mean to live well and help enable all to flourish. And as Christians, we can step more into that. To be inspired by that and work hard for that, live for that, and speak up for that. So you know, what it means to love our neighbour and use our influence for good. There's a lot of scope, I think, for us as Christians to lean into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I met with a number of our heads and chairs of our Melbourne Anglican service agencies just last week, and Joe was part of that. But certainly is there. There's a really big vision in lots of areas of aged care, community service, policies about children and families, participation, employment. It's interested, Michelle, in your views. How do politicians, do they compartmentalise this? Because they must be getting lots of people in a very organised way, knowing elections happening, coming with various policy platforms to them, but then they've also got this focus group kind of information, often in marginal seat, where it seems that the biggest impact will be. How do in your experience, politicians process those sort of multiple kinds of pressures or sources of aspiration?
Well, I think you've got to look at the context in which the politicians are operating. And if we take the here and now, you've got a government that's really on the back foot. It's an old government in the sense of having been there since 2013, and it is getting pretty desperate about its situation. So the sort of things that it's listening to are very much those that it feels will help it retain office, and that acts as a filter, if you like. You've also got on the other side an opposition that sees a real chance of power, so it's listening to advice that is telling it the best way to office. So the government and opposition are not as open-minded as we might expect them to be. In terms of who they actually do listen to, well, squeaky wheels, I think, have a bigger voice probably than the quieter advocates. Now, it was interesting the point that's made about the churches. compared to the past, I think that the churches are less loud in loud in a good sense in the public space than we might remember some years ago in terms of their advocacy and their influence. Maybe they don't have the ways into the political class that they once did, but for whatever reason, if you look back on this term, the church's voices have been more for protective things for themselves in some cases, the religious discrimination legislation and debate, than being heard very loudly for other sorts of positive issues and influences.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a fair observation. And I know one area of advocacy that I've been involved in for quite a long time, which is the whole question of how we treat refugees and asylum seekers, particularly asylum seekers, knowing that there's some people in long immigration detention, and just how those matters get into a vision, because I think that Christians come with a narrative that it's okay to reboot things. There's a long kind of biblical narrative of years of Jubilee, of things being restored. And we seem to have a political narrative that says you must be unbending in the pursuit of a policy. If the slightest blink exposes you to, I guess, criticism from others. And I'm just interested, Joe, how much you've seen this play out over a number of issues, but how much is there this kind of fear of looking weak before an electorate that actually may be an impediment to some better decision making happening?
Yeah, I certainly know from sort of training essentially constituent lobbyists, Christians who are spending time to speak up to their politicians in electorates all around the country, that it is very common when they do get access to the MP or candidate, even if they are one that's quite a significant decision maker, and often our campaigns have targeted either marginal electorates or significant decision makers, they will spend a lot of time saying how hamstrung they are, that they themselves have no power in that situation, and they agree furiously with the concerns of the constituent about refugees or foreign aid or changing climate, but it's the party and so forth. So there's a lot of inability to, I guess, realise and own the power that they hold and be accountable to their constituents, and to spare no effort to find a way forward. For example, with climate change in our country and the absolute lack of a national plan or ambition to meet world cooperation that is required to meet a challenge like that. You know, I have Christians, quiet, persistent widows, often, you know, I think of that passage in the Bible, who will just keep asking and asking for a meeting with their politician to talk about this, to raise how a changing climate is impacting the poor around the world, to share why they care from a faith perspective, that we spare no effort, that we do everything possible to look after the poor and, you know, live within our environmental limits. And so the option to work across the aisle and actually find solutions, all that holds us back is political will and perhaps a fair bit of political donations and the mining lobby in that mix. But, you know, there is ways forward if there's political will. And so often there's that issue there that constituents are finding when they have those conversations with politicians, even when done very respectfully and persistently.
Now, Michelle, well-funded independents in some key seats. What sort of a disruption is that going to be in the election?
A very interesting question about this election. Of course, sometimes in the recent past, we've seen the independents' prospects talked up and then they're not really met in terms of votes. My feeling is that there won't be some surge of independents into Parliament, possibly 1 seat, remotely 2 seats. I'm talking about new independents here. I think that most of those crossbenchers in the lower house who are already there will be re-elected. But in terms of the new batch, I think that they're having an influence, but that won't necessarily translate into results in the Parliament. But that influence is important, especially it is quite disruptive for the Liberal Party, which is having to spend more money and more effort than it would normally in a number of seats that are basically pretty safe Liberal seats. And of course, it affects the conversation in those seats and therefore the political conversation more widely. So the independents are important, but the power of that movement to actually deliver bodies in Parliament, new bodies in Parliament, is limited.
And of course, we're in a period of time of, I think, great uncertainty, certainly internationally, with political circumstances in Europe that seems to have seized our daily attention. And we've also got these eye-watering numbers of deficits, having been told for almost several generations that deficits are not a good thing. We now have deficits that seem to run into the future limitlessly. How are we having those things explained to us in a meaningful way in terms of policy? I'll perhaps start with you first, Joe, because I think you're an area where often overseas aid funding seems to be a bit of a discretionary way of balancing a budget by trimming that down or reallocating it. So how do you think is there a convincing narrative that informs people what that all means?
Yeah, it is interesting how many years this particular government focused on, balancing the budget as sort of a main sort of hallmark of their credentials, but it did slip away, and now deficits are that sort of whole framing and conversation has just been sort of evaporated. And look, I think the average Australian doesn't pay huge attention to that, probably feels a bit concerned of the level of debt we're under, but household debt compared to national economies and, investing in intergenerations, they are different things. But certainly for many years, foreign aid was cut to its deepest levels under this government on that rationale that we can't afford it, even though we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So that hasn't changed since sort of the deficits and that sort of framing has been thrown out, except for temporary COVID relief measures that have been announced reasonably quietly, that I think polling would show that the government doesn't think that they want to get lots of news stories up about responding to the COVID pandemic in our neighbourhood. So we're certainly not seeing an increase in aid. It's still on a downward trajectory at some of the nation's lowest. So if my kids are pretty sort of clued up in their sort of lower primary years to thinking about money, and $100 is a lot of money for them, and they can sort of imagine what a $100 note would look like. Notes don't really float around the house, but when we talk about show them a 20-cent piece and say, well, this is how much out of $100 Australia's giving to people who are poor. Does that feel right? And that doesn't pass their, the gut test. It's like, oh, that isn't very much. So whether it's 22 cents sliding down to 19 cents, either way, it's not enough. And, we were talking about, when in history, because many times in history, the church has been at the forefront of calling for structural change and being generous and responding to people in poverty. Back in 1958, the World Council of Churches passed a resolution that was around the wealthier countries giving 1% of their incomes to the poorer nations. That then went through the UN General Assembly, and then by 1968, the wealthy aid-giving nations had all agreed to what we now refer to as the 0.7% commitment of all our national wealth. That 0.7% would be given to the poorer nations, and the rest of making up that 1% from private donations, which we know individuals are very generous and respond, through private capital. So Australia's slipped down. We've made this international promise back decades ago around 0.7%. We haven't reached that, but we're actually heading in the opposite direction as our wealth and our ability grows. We're now, stuck between Italy and Hungary on the rankings of aid-giving nations, and that just doesn't reflect, where Canada or New Zealand or UK, any of the other sort of like economies are. These are choices we make as a nation, and often our public is fairly silent on that, unfortunately.
And Michelle, how do you see on any of these big issues? How do you see the election opening that conversation up about choice and values, and what sort of a society we want to be, and a nation in the world we want to be in?
Well, I think that that big issue, those big questions, are not going to be to the forefront. On your point about debt and deficit, obviously things transformed when we had the pandemic, and I think that the decision for big spending was both justified and necessary in that context. Now, because we're in this election situation, neither side of politics is going to come to grips with that publicly before the election. I think if the government is returned, then it would start fairly soon to address that question of debt and deficit, because it does go to some of its core preoccupations. If the opposition is elected, maybe it would take a bit longer, but I do think that Labor is professing to be fiscally responsible, that is its orientation these days, and therefore it would have to deal with those issues sooner or later. If I could just go back to this question of aid, aid is really very much off our political agendas at the moment, and of course that is a bad thing, but I can't see it being brought to the fore anytime soon. But I would refer you to an essay that I actually happen to have here by Gareth Evans, a little book called Good International Citizenship, The Case for Decency. And Gareth, of course, a former foreign minister, as everyone knows, is very strong on this question of aid, and also recounts how when he was foreign minister and Labor was providing more aid as a proportion of GDP than is the case now, even then he had quite a struggle, that colleagues were always wanting to dip into the aid budget for other purposes, and even to keep it at a certain level, he was in an uphill fight and didn't manage to increase it to bigger levels. So it's not a good story on the aid front, and I can't see it getting any better soon. The other point I'd make about aid is that we have become more utilitarian in our approach to aid. In other words, the Pacific is more favoured than the African area, and that is because we see that in our direct national interests in terms of competition with China for influence in that region. So both on quantity and in direction, we are a lot less idealistic than, if you want to put it in those terms, or decent than we should be.
Yeah, it's interesting. You both painted a picture of, I think, what I experienced, that most politicians I run into seem very decent and responsible people wanting to make an impact. But there is this sort of sense that's come through both your comments about when collectively people go together, decisions are made that don't seem to look like the sum of the encounter you might have at an interpersonal level. I think that's one thing. And then there's this other one, Michelle, which is even scarier, that we've almost got to try and read the invisible thread of what really will happen, not the pre-election rhetoric, which gets a party over the line. What's going to really matter is what they're not telling you, because that'll be the agenda. And you've got to kind of guess that or anticipate it. Am I being too cynical in hearing those things coming through both your comments?
No, I don't think you are being too cynical, unfortunately. I think in terms of, to take the second question first, what we'll get, yes, it is a bit of a mystery. I put one rider on that politicians do know that if they break promises or undertakings blatantly, there is a backlash these days, and we only have to remember the Abbott government to understand that. But there's uncertainty because firstly, we don't know how the world is going to evolve in the next few years, either in terms of the pandemic or now internationally, where it's very scary. And secondly, because this is an election where, in a way, the undertakings are so limited, that there's got to be more, almost by definition, from each side, whoever is elected. So those two things, I think, introduce this element of uncertainty, and there are legitimate reasons for that, as well as politicians not telling us, because they really don't know what they'll be doing in, say, 3 years. On your first point about everybody being very nice when you go to their offices, well, especially as representatives of the church, of course, they will be polite and respectful, and they will be sympathetic. But that doesn't commit them to anything. It certainly doesn't commit them to strong advocacy within their own ranks. And also, I'd make the point, which is pretty depressing, I guess, that if you're from the church or a church, it might depend where you're coming from. If you're from a church in Western Sydney, I suspect that you might have more agency than if you're from a church in certain other areas, because the politicians know that the church vote, and I'm talking, as I say, multiple churches, not necessarily one particular faith, but the church vote is important in certain areas, but not in others.
Yes, and that's that phenomenon of the large number of marginal seats in Western Sydney, and I guess a fair bit of focus group attention being played there. And Joe, there's mind-boggling numbers that really are being put around about some of these very long-term future military investments, submarines and everything else. The numbers just seem to be in the billions and keep blowing out. Do you think we're, especially in uncertain times, going to have what people are probably calling a car key election, something that ratchets up military security and military spending?
And look, it certainly suit the framing of the coalition, and I very much hope it isn't. That, because it plays into our nation's fears, and my experience, certainly as a younger refugee advocate, is with the Tampa election and others, is that is never good for the marginalised in Australia or our neighbourhoods. So I think we don't want to see an election that plays into fears, but that governments who are desperate to be re-elected may well reach for that. But I think it is part of a conversation that we need to have of where do we prioritise our common wealth, our taxes, our economy. So whom does the economy serve? Are we okay with huge amounts being committed into the long term for infrastructure projects that may or may not have, had much due diligence, propping up fossil fuel industries, or in this case, defence, and a bunch of spending that may not have been gone through much due diligence. So how do we react as a community to that, and bother to speak up and let it be known that maybe that's not okay, maybe that's not reflecting the priorities of the community, that we'd love to see just as much attention put on homelessness and, job creation, jobs for the future, all sorts of issues that we have that we could think radically on. Certainly in my years with foreign aid has seen, that particular area decline constantly, yet defence is untouchable and just grows. So we live in an interconnected world, and it doesn't make sense to just spend so much money on, for example, a presence in Afghanistan and not be able to provide aid and respond to state breakdown when it happens. So the different portfolios, I think, need to be seen a little bit more holistically in an interconnected world.
And Michelle, what do you think about the prospects of an election, which is a khaki election?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that in the last few days, you've got the Prime Minister, who, of course, is, as we speak, campaigning in Western Australia, the first time he's been there for a very long time because of the closed border. He's talking defence and handing out a lot of money for a construction area, shipyard construction area there, and we've had the announcement about more defence personnel and the subs base on the East Coast in recent times. But what is the actual political debate at this instant? It's about petrol. So ordinary people, it seems, concentrating on cost of living and petrol prices and issues of this sort, where the government has been trying to talk up a storm for a khaki election. Now, I'm talking about how the conversation's going at the moment, and as we know, things change very quickly, but I think that's quite an interesting dichotomy, really, that we're seeing in the pre-election debate. And the government is, as it puts the finishing touches on the budget, is obviously having to think about this cost of living issue rather than the defence numbers that will be in the budget. Of course, the whole, if you take it out of the election context, the whole issue of defence is a very important one of itself in a world that is really changing so rapidly in international power terms, and is very hard to anticipate if you're looking decades ahead.
Yeah, it puzzles me that we seem to be pretty ambiguous about what our policy position is, especially about manufacturing. So we just go to that. We'll often think that we will far better off rely on international supply chains and source things that are manufactured through that means. And I think that's a long established policy, the loss of a lot of local manufacturing. But then we get these big kind of projects that we don't have a lot of skill in, and we seem to be, politicians seem to be very committed to talking up a local manufacturing side. So something we've never made before, we'll probably never make again. There might only be 5 or 6 of them, but we decide we'll set up some sort of manufacturing hub to do that. It just strikes me as being an odd position. We're caught between the big heroic multi-billion-dollar projects, seeming to always need to have a local manufacturing component, and otherwise the fairly broad agreement, we don't need to manufacture things in Australia anymore. I don't know how we balance that, or whether I've got the wrong perception about that policy confusion. What do you think, Michelle?
Well, I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a move away from globalization and the idea that the freer the trade, the better, and that we need to specialize in what we're good at and buy in things that we're not good at producing. And the factors going into that move, the pandemic, which has brought us to realise that supply chains in basics, even like medicines, pharmaceuticals, can be easily disrupted by that sort of event. And secondly, the changing international situation, which has become so much more insecure, and especially the increasing assertiveness of China and the difficulty of reading what all that will mean for the long term, has turned us inwards and again made us feel not only that we need better defence preparedness, but also that we need more supply chain protection and more diversity in our export markets, and also the ability to produce more of what we need here. So I think those sorts of factors are taking us away from a more globalised approach and focusing more on being self-sufficient. Maybe the very globalised approach is one that's fostered by a more secure international situation, whether that's in terms of power relationships between major countries, or whether it's in terms of not health threats of the sort that we've just been through. Now whether that'll change over the next few years, who knows, but probably it won't.
And Joe, what are alternative ways of peacemaking, new collaborations? I just think that I was talking to someone the other day about who is a fairly knowledgeable person in this space, who thinks that there is a good opportunity of collaboration between Australia and China in terms of the military regime in Myanmar. And this person was thinking that we could do some useful out-of-the-box imagining and back-channel work with perhaps another partner who doesn't look like an obvious one, to do some good there. Are we capable in our political process of thinking of alternative strategies of impact for good, or does it just get left behind in all the things we're talking about?
Look, I think just the broader point of, back channels and diplomacy, some of the best work that will happen we won't see. And that's probably necessary for it to be able to be successful. I think we see all sorts of unlikely players working across civil society, and you wouldn't normally put them together, but that can be the difference, that secret sauce that shows that something is different and possible, or that gets to that tipping point. So my experience is, the more unlikely the players, the more likely you could actually get a way forward if people can put aside their traditional set boundaries of what is or isn't the case. I think that happens at international levels, but it also happens in the church. It happens in civil society, and we see movements of change, and the church working globally and playing all sorts of unlikely, very quiet brokering at other times, lobbying at the United Nations levels or other areas. So the more that unlikely players work together, the climate movement's certainly shown how civil society groups, more radical green groups, and business are working together in very surprising ways. So I think that's a really interesting way forward for unlocking the best of solutions from different facets of society, and the more that might be able to take place in unusual ways, can tend to unlock international issues that otherwise seem at a stalemate. So, but yes, tend to be behind closed doors, I'd say.
And can I remind our wider attendants today that your chance of participating in some questioning is through using the chat function, and encourage you to put any questions you'd like opened up here in the chat function, and we can then proceed that. And I think there's one little instruction how you might do that. It's just gone up already. I just want to open up I suppose what I think has been a change in Australian society of the leadership role and the flagship role of the Prime Minister, or those who would want to be the Prime Minister, and the whole personality expectations we have, and the person who holds the role being the conduit of appropriate empathy, or these have been long changes. I think we saw that with President Obama in the things in the oil spills in the Mexican Gulf. He didn't respond as quickly and was hammered with that. We've seen questions about our Prime Minister and his response to bushfires or floods. But is there any realism in this, or is this just projecting a fairly destructive fantasy on our political system, which isn't actually meant to operate in this kind of way? What do you think? What do you think, Joe?
Oh, I thought Michelle might like to answer that.
Oh, well, I'll come to Michelle directly.
No, I feel like you're followed and had the most incredible commentary on our prime ministers that I want to hear what Michelle wants to say on that.
Sure, we can go to Michelle first. What do you think, Michelle?
Well, look, I think that's an interesting point of view, not a fashionable one at the moment, because people are making incredible demands of leaders to do things that really are not possible, or to do them very quickly in situations where that's unrealistic. And I do think in this debate that we've seen about who's to blame for what in the floods, in response to the floods, we get an example of this. People were saying immediately that the community shouldn't have had to go out and rescue people. But I think that was unrealistic, both if you look at how natural disasters have played out in the past, and if you look at the possibility for agencies to respond quickly. You've always had instant reactions by community members. If you think about the country, for example, properties have always, in my memory, had fire trucks, for example, and if there was a fire, I don't mean some of these horrendous bushfires we've seen in the last few years, but if there was a fire locally, the locals would go out and help with that, as well as the professional fire authorities. So I do think you get a certain lack of realism in these situations about how much can be done, how quickly. Now, that is not to say that in this recent instance that some authorities haven't been at fault and eventually will know that, but you also have to put it, I think, in a perspective of what can be done. And you've also got to feed into this that people who are totally traumatized, who've lost everything, will be very critical of how things were handled, but their perspective is absolutely understandable, but not necessarily realistic when you look at the full picture.
I think that's true, and I think you've got, as you're saying, Michelle, things which would once have been thought to be Australian virtues about helping out and citizen-led initiative and stuff that would have been celebrated as part of a heroic Australian character. We seem to just have a public narrative now that there's got to be someone who is at fault, or some agency or some arm of government that was deficient and should have known better. And that's not to take away that kind of scrutiny, but there is, I think, a bit of a shift. And I think maybe the political leaders have been willing participants in it. I recall back, I think it was 99, when I thought unusually at the time when we had the canyoning disaster, I think in Switzerland, where about 12 or 14 Australians died, Prime Minister Howard went across there to sort of lead the mourning, whereas formally I would have expected the Governor General to do an international representation on behalf of the nation like that. So I think we've had far more than 2 decades of the willingness of political leaders to step into that symbolic and I think it's an interpretive role of the emotions of the nation, and that's I think, as they all find out, a pretty tricky place, tricky grounds to play in, because you simply can't get it right all the time.
Well, this is part also of a wider phenomenon, and that is that the political leaders actually want to step into everything. They want to be all present, and the media asks them for a view on a whole lot of things that really they haven't any particular role in or expertise in. And not only do they want to be stepping into everything, but they want to be out there, visible all the time. And so throughout a parliamentary term, not just at election time, you see a great deal of them. You sometimes think that they'd be better spending a bit more time with the door closed and the feet under the desk.
Joe, what's your views on that?
No, look, I was thinking of the power and the opportunity that politicians do have to capture the mood of a nation, whether it's Jacinda Ardern after the terrible violence that happened in New Zealand, or even I was thinking of Bob Hawke and Australia winning the Australia's Cup. So, it can be an opportunity for positive empathy, or channeling the mood of a nation, and our leaders can lead us in the direction of hope and vision as well. So they can use that power for good, as can we all. But there can be a positive side to it as well.
Yeah, we've got a few questions which I might just turn to that have come up in the chat function. I think this is a good one that follows on. Justin Michelle's asked that, do we get the politicians and leaders that we deserve? And do we need in some way a better electorate? How do we get that? You sometimes wonder how much apathy there is in our electorate. If we didn't have compulsory voting, would we get much of a turnout in different times? But do we get the politicians that we deserve, or and additionally, do we need to be a better electorate?
Is this for me?
Why not?
Well, I think probably yes. And I think, yes, we do need to be a better electorate. I think that many good people are being put off a political career because of the nature of politics. They just don't want, well, it's not just that they don't want the scrutiny, but they don't want the nastiness and the intrusiveness that is in our political system. I don't know how you reduce that, but I do think that it's a disincentive to quite a few quality people who just think, well, I don't want to live that sort of life. I don't want to even participate in that sort of life. And that means that the political class is diminished and is reduced in quality from what it might be if you were drawing from a wider range of people. And that also goes to the nature of political parties these days, which are shells of their former selves. I'm talking about the major parties. And that's partly because people don't want to participate in politics. It's partly because of the nature of our society, where people are busier, don't want to go out to meetings with long political discussions, and there's a lot of disincentives to becoming active in a party, and if you have fewer people within the party, that also contributes to a smaller pool of potential candidates for office. So I think that there are a number of factors leading to the fact that we don't have the best of the crop when it comes to our politicians.
Yeah, look, it was interesting. I spoke to someone early in their parliamentary career, and this person was saying to me that they really were much more of they had a much more of an appetite for policy than they had for the politics. I think they meant some of the internal deal making and the things that we spoke about earlier as to how eventually a consensus is found. And I found that encouraging, but I also know that unless people can manage the political influence side, their best aspirations at developing policy tend to not come to fruition. So I'm sure it's a balance for people. And what about the electorate? How do we get the electorate to be more informed? Joe, your
this is an area. Yeah, this is an area of my passion, as is, more good people and women feeling like they can enter our political systems and our parties not being as stale as they are. But yeah, look, I think we learn by doing it. So many groups that I've trained over the years of how to engage in the most basic levels in our democracy and beyond the vote on ballot day is quite a new experience for most people. To write a handwritten card and engage with your politician and share, a congratulatory message saying, these are the things that I care about. I'm really urging you on in these particular areas is very outside normal practice for most Australians, and unfortunately is a muscle that we have got a bit weak in the church. To go further and actually cultivate relationship and conversation with our politicians is again something that in people's busy lives or in feeling confused about all the different policy responses, it has a silencing effect. And unfortunately, in all of these groups in civil society, the charity sector particularly, is being clamped down for doing advocacy. We have seen in recent years a tightening of the civil society space of what is possible for charities to do in the advocacy space. And we are often the ones out there training and equipping people with, here are the different policy positions in a non-partisan way. Here are basic tools of how to have a conversation with a politician and not just have a nice little photo op where everyone walks away and no commitment was made. These are the things that we get better at by doing. And I think in the church, we can play a significant role if we can remember and wake up to how to do it. And it starts, I think, with the theological conviction, getting a theology of justice and a passion for the common good and seeking the welfare of others, responding to our neighbours in love, getting that as a fire in the belly, and then turning that into action and working with Christian groups and others in civil society who together can raise a united voice that does draw on well thought out policy. And there's training and no shortage of opportunities if people have that desire to step in and feel that they can respond to our democratic gifts, fully. I work with so many people around the world who are in such situations that they can only dream of the freedoms that we have in our democracy. They can only dream of what it would be to have a vote and to have a say. And we have to remember that that is an incredible blessing, and we need to use that wisely. We need to think through, how can I best use my vote, not for my own tribe or my own self-interest, but how can I seek for the common good? How can I think and pray about my vote and then engage beyond voting day? And that's a wonderful space for the church to reawaken and sort of get better at doing. The more we do, the better we'll get.
Michelle, Denise has got a question for you, really a question about journalists and how responsible are journalists for generating a mood of blame and conflict, contrasted with just straight reporting. And you might want to, comment on the whole investment, I suppose, and what the political journalism career path is like, and the resourcing of journalism in the modern non-newspaper dominant era, I guess. Totally free palette for you to respond to how journalists fit into this story.
Well, I think they are quite responsible for the emphasis on fault and blame. Now, I would say that one of the main roles of the media is to hold power accountable, so that is an important role, but it's a question of always of balance. And I think that the balance has probably shifted negatively. And also, of course, what we've got these days is much more commentary in journalism, and that sometimes takes away from straight reporting of things, and that can be quite frustrating, I think, for readers and viewers who like more separation of opinion and factual reporting. One of the things that we have been increasingly seeing in the current situation is a polarization of the media, and we are seeing that in this election. Outlets like Sky, for example, run very, very hard on opinion and advocacy for certain views and sides, one side of politics. And I think, and denigration of other media outlets, in Sky's case, denigration very strongly of the ABC. We're talking here about Sky at night, not Sky in the day, but that this polarisation, I think, is to be highly regretted in our media scene. Also, because of the 24-hour news cycle, the need to fill that space, you find journalists doing more with less resources, less time, and that does have a bad impact sometimes on how the news comes out, because simply because people don't have enough time to put together things to best effect. So there are a number of trends in the media in recent years that I think have made it more negative and have taken away from coverage. Also, I mean, we mustn't lose sight of the effect of social media, which is very much a two-edged sword. Very good in connecting people, in enabling people without a voice to have a say in producing some diversity, but at the same time has taken the political debate down into very dark areas that certainly are not good for our democracy. So we do have at the moment this paradox, I might say, of a very concentrated media, especially mainly the legacy media. On the other hand, you have the diversity of social media, and those who defend the concentration would say, well, the fact you've got all this social media means the concentration doesn't matter. I think that's a fallacious argument. The concentration does matter, because that is the media that many people are seeing and relying on, and that's the part of the media that has the actual resources to collect news in the way that the more diverse social media often doesn't.
No, thanks, Michelle. There's a question from Nils, which is really about the last federal election view Nils has, that thought that the public fell for tax cuts from a government that lacked a vision for the country. And the question is, what can civil society do to strongly encourage a stronger vision for our nation? Jo, that's something you want to open up with?
Yeah, look, I think civil society, in my experience, works together really well. And if anything, it's about getting cut through to be heard. As Michelle was saying, there's so much noise. Anglicare Australia, for example, which is, represents masses of services around Australia. They have reflected on the vacuum of leadership and ideas, and they've come up with 5 great ideas for a way forward for Australia that have been come through consultative processes, have been costed and put in that solutions framework. So in their case, it's from ideas, let me just bring them up, for addressing our poverty crisis through a basic income for all, investing in jobs and workforce for the future with a jobs guarantee, a community climate fund that will actually put people and the vulnerabilities that we face moving forward with changing climate in this nation first and foremost. Looking at social housing and meeting the shortfall there with 500,000 new homes for housing solutions, and then finally reflecting on the past couple of years with the pandemic and how governments have made decisions and spent resources to say it's time for People's Inquiry to be able to hold those decisions to some scrutiny and actually have that space to reflect and ask, how did that go? So I see, a peak group like Anglicare Australia taking excellent ways forward of solutions and, joining the conversation, trying to lead the conversation around some ways forward in the areas of their expertise and lived experience, providing services all around the country, as do, peak aid bodies, the peak climate bodies are working together. So there's a lot of solutions and options for a vision, but there is some of this disconnect between how noisy it is and where are the forums in our modern society that we can genuinely have these deeper conversations about a vision forward that isn't a tweet and isn't just those who get a few seconds on TV or so forth. So we do have a bit of a lack of those forums in our modern Australian society where we have the space and time for those ideas to breathe. So that might be something moving forward. I know, Rudd, when he first was elected, tried to have a bit of an ideas forum. People were a bit cynical. Where did all the ideas go? What happens to the butcher's paper once you've put all these ideas up? But I think that there is this vacuum and an opportunity to do something about it, and perhaps that will be more likely post-election.
And I think equally there is the phenomenon of political parties suffering from very substantial loss of membership or lack of growth of membership, no longer necessarily grassroots organisations. We see across the diversity of the spectrum of politics, branch stacking efforts of various kinds, because it's relatively easy to sway outcomes because of the small membership that might be involved in selecting candidates, and increasingly people who are very much schooled and grown up as political apparatchiks, maturing into elected members through these processes. And at the same time, we see probably some very wealthy citizens wanting to either be disruptors or investors in the discourse. And whatever you might think of Clive Palmer, a wealthy citizen who seems to have no limit to the amount of money he wants to put into his vision of influencing the political system. So there's something of a dichotomy. How do you feel about that, Michelle? Where do you think that we can see this kind of balance come out better?
Well, I think your identification of the apparatchiks going on to be the politicians is an important point that probably in some earlier decades we got more diverse people, well, not probably, certainly more diverse people into our parliament, so they had different life experiences and they hadn't been sort of bred as fighting dogs, as it were, and therefore that had all sorts of more positive effects. I think that the Clive Palmer situation takes us to issues of political donations, the regulation of money in politics, maybe political advertising, although that's a very difficult and fraught area. But certainly I think donation reform is a big issue, and the idea that money doesn't talk, that you pay huge amounts to have dinner with the Prime Minister just because you want to get to know Scott for his personality, this is a nonsense. People pay a lot of money whether to meet politicians or to engage lobbyists to help them through the system, because they think that will improve their chances of getting results. Sometimes, of course, it doesn't, but certainly that's the aim, and sometimes it does. If I could go back to the earlier point about the broad agendas that organisations, church bodies and so on are putting up, my feeling is that if you want change in certain areas, maybe it's better to go smaller. So not argue for a broad agenda of multiple issues and broad ambitions in those particular areas, but to say, here's what we should do on item X, and have a very practical, albeit limited, set of goals and policies and proposals. And if you're seeking to do that through politicians, find people who are sympathetic to your cause and potentially have some influence. So rather than necessarily targeting all the politicians, just see what pathways there are into the political system for manageable goals. Now, I'm not saying you don't do the broader work too, but I just think that to achieve results, that may be a way into a system which is quite difficult to penetrate, albeit it looks very open.
I'd agree with that, it can depend on the part you play in the system as to the best influence you can have. So if you're a technical service provider or a peak body, then it's going to be outside of an election cycle. Perhaps you have a call before an election, but it's the technical work of who are the power players and the decision makers that detailed policy shift can happen over time. Whereas if you're the ordinary citizen, you might have, a more general, I care about these issues and I'm sort of urging you to do more. And the more active citizens can tap into campaigns so that their efforts are well stewarded and are joined up with the efforts or similar sort of calls of others, that they don't have to come up with all those solutions, but they can have sort of a similar policy ask, essentially at a less detailed level. But different messengers will be important in the system in creating change inside and outside, and that's everyone from protesters and non-violent direct action people, such as we've seen, bishops from our diocese in cages outside the Park Hotel, which has been really wonderful to see the attention drawn to, people in long-term detention, through to the conversations that will need to happen behind closed doors, well away from any media headlines around you know, actual details of policy levers that could shift to bring about the same outcome. So change and pressure from all sides of a system tends to be what's needed, and people playing to their strengths.
Yeah, and I think that the last question we could probably cover off briefly is from Felicity about, I suppose, your strategic alignment of what we do, especially in the Pacific. And Felicity was just observing that perhaps Australians might be a bit surprised that there are, whilst we've got a relief ship in Tonga after the cyclone, and ours is kind of, our naval ship's broken down, and we've got a couple of Chinese relief ships coming there, and this whole sense of, I suppose, the soft edge of power, and are we exercising that soft power in our own neighbourhood as constructively as we might? You can do one first, Joe.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, certainly responding to our neighbours in the Pacific region is the smart and the right thing to do, and that is certainly the conversation that we have with politicians. That it's not an optional extra, and those that might be, you know, faith messengers coming from faith communities will be expressing it from a particular, you know, moral imperative. But for a politician in the more hard-headed sense, to say it's the right and the smart thing to do, and that's certainly part of you know, what Michelle was referring to with Gareth Evans' new essay around, you know, the case for decency. We live in an interconnected, you know, world, and the way Australia behaves in different forums internationally, it does all relate. So, you know, when China is exerting the influence without necessarily the all the ties that can come with the way Australia might provide support, then it is an attractive option, certainly to start with, and certainly there are loans and a long tail to some of the approaches. But the way Australia keeps thumbing its nose at the Pacific calls around Australia's action on climate change, they start to all interrelate. So the way we react and behave on aid is connected with our posture on other issues. And certainly, yeah, China has the Pacific in its sights, and that's something Foreign Affairs is looking very closely at, and you know, you can see the pivot of the Australian aid program to our region is very much influenced by that.
Well, I think we're at the time where we need to wrap up. Normally, I'd ask our audience to give some generous appreciation, but we only can do that virtually. But Joe, thank you for your insights and participation today, and Michelle, thanks for what you've reflected and shared with us. And we'll see in the unfolding weeks which of our either most optimistic forecasts or our direst predictions land as, and it'll probably tell us something about the corporate character of us as a nation, and certainly the individual character of various actors and commentators under the spotlight. And I often do feel that these, after all, politicians are humans like us, perhaps with a bit of a different ego and ambition and aspiration, but I always have a sense of the weight of what the cost is for them as being actors in these big public dramas. So thanks for your participation today, and thanks everyone who's come online. I'm just going to conclude with a prayer, picking up some of those themes that we had, because this is our democracy is a very precious gift, and as Joe said, there are many in the world who would like to even have a share of the worst aspects of our democracy, let alone the experience of the best of it. And we're very conscious of the seeming desire to extinguish democracy in Ukraine, and the heroism of people who say this will not happen, and all of the policy uncertainty that sits there. But that perhaps is a topic for another day. So let me pray as we conclude. Loving God, we thank you that you call us to love neighbour as we love ourselves. Help us to manifest what that reality looks like in the circumstances of a federal election. Help us to hear beyond the sharpness of opinion and the questions of attack and projection of personality, that we might see those things that really matter, that will help shape our nation to be a place which is more participatory, more just, more able to have a constructive role in the international community of nations, and a place for the flourishing and better participation of all who are part of our society. And we pray that some of those issues like reconciliation and the recognition of Indigenous peoples in the life of our decision making might find their place in our discussions, despite the many other things that will be in that active space. We pray all of this and commend our politicians to your guidance and care in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you, everyone, and delight to have those on board who've been at a distance. And thank you once again, Joe, and thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.